A black man tries to rent an expensive apartment. When the staff treats him poorly, his next move shocks everyone. Marcus took a deep breath as he stood before the massive glass doors of the penthouse. His reflection stared back at him from the polished surface, a mixture of pride and apprehension evident in his expression. He had made it. He was standing in front of a place few people like him could ever dream of owning. But despite the success, a small knot of unease twisted in his stomach. The marble floors, the glass walls, the silent elegance of the space, it all felt pristine and foreign, a world away from where he had started. He was proud of himself, but he couldn't shake the feeling that, in a way, he still didn't belong. Marcus adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit, his fingers lingering for a moment as if steadying himself before stepping inside. The penthouse was beautiful. There was no doubt about it. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a stunning view of the city, sprawling far below him like a canvas of opportunity. But it wasn't just the city below that weighed on his mind. It was everything this place symbolized, the barriers he had broken to be here, and the ones that still remained. The doorbell echoed through the open space, its sound pulling Marcus from his thoughts. His heart quickened. This was it, the first of many encounters with the world he was about to step into. He straightened his back, put on a smile, and opened the door. Karen and David, the real estate agents, stood on the threshold. Karen's perfectly coiffed blonde hair and tailored dress matched her overly enthusiastic smile. David, taller and more reserved, offered a nod of greeting, his gaze flicking to Marcus with a brief moment of what seemed like surprise before quickly composing himself. "Marcus, so good to see you again," Karen chimed, stepping into the room with the practiced grace of someone used to selling high-end properties. Her voice was bright, but there was an undercurrent, an awkwardness, a slight hesitation, almost as if she were trying a bit too hard. David followed behind, his silence speaking volumes. "Thank you for coming," Marcus said, his voice steady, though he could feel the tension beneath the surface. He could sense their surprise, the unspoken questions in their eyes as they took in the space, and him. It wasn't the first time he'd encountered that look, the slight pause before someone realized they weren't sure what to expect from a black man in a penthouse like this. As Karen and David moved into the living area, Marcus trailed behind, keeping his expression neutral. They glanced around, their eyes lingering on the decor, the finishes, the view, every detail analyzed with a critical eye. It wasn't just the penthouse they were judging. He could feel it. The unspoken assessment of whether he, Marcus, belonged in a place like this. David cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "You've really got quite the place here. Not many people get to own something like this." His words hung in the air, the implication clear. Marcus caught the brief hesitation, the way David's tone shifted ever so slightly, as if trying to mask the surprise still lingering beneath his professional exterior. It wasn't hostile, just uncertain. But Marcus had learned to pick up on the subtleties. He smiled politely, pushing back the flicker of irritation. "It's been a long journey," Marcus replied, his voice calm, though inside, the tension simmered. He had worked for years to get here, but moments like this reminded him that no matter how far he climbed, there would always be someone questioning how he had done it. Karen, sensing the unease, jumped in. "Yes, well, you certainly deserve it. It's an incredible space, and the neighborhood is just perfect for someone with your background." She smiled wider, but her choice of words sent a chill down Marcus's spine. Background. He wasn't sure if she meant his success or something else entirely. Either way, it felt like another subtle reminder of the invisible line that separated him from the world he was trying to break into. Just then, the front door opened again, and Emma walked in, her presence immediately lightening the atmosphere. She strode over to Marcus with a wide smile, embracing him with the warmth he had been craving in this space. Emma, with her natural confidence and easy grace, had a way of grounding him. She pulled back from the hug, her eyes scanning the room before landing on Marcus. "This place is stunning," she said, but her focus wasn't on the view or the luxury. It was on him. She could see the uncertainty in his eyes. "But you didn't work this hard just for a penthouse, did you?" Marcus blinked, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" Emma tilted her head, her gaze softening. "This is incredible, Marcus. But is this it? Is this what you really wanted? Or is there more?" Her words hit him harder than he expected. He had spent so long working toward this goal, pushing himself to achieve what many told him was impossible. But now that he was here, standing in this sleek, expensive penthouse, he couldn't shake the feeling that Emma was right. Was this really enough? Was this where the journey ended? I don't know, he admitted after a pause, his voice quieter now. I thought this was what I wanted, but maybe there's more. Emma smiled, resting a hand on his arm. There's always more, Marcus. You've come so far. Don't stop now. Karen and David finished their walkthrough, still spouting praises for the penthouse, though their words felt increasingly hollow. Marcus was beginning to see through them. They weren't just selling the penthouse. They were selling an idea, an image of success that didn't necessarily align with his own. But he wasn't just here to fit into their mold. He had his own path to carve, one that went beyond the walls of this luxury space. As Karen and David prepared to leave, Karen turned to Marcus with a wide smile. You'll be quite the addition to the building, Marcus. The other residents will, well, they'll be very interested to meet you. Marcus didn't miss the slight pause, the careful choice of words. Interested. That could mean a lot of things. But he didn't flinch. Instead, he smiled back. I'm looking forward to it. When the door closed behind them, Marcus stood still for a moment, his thoughts swirling. The penthouse was quiet now, but the weight of everything that had just happened, Karen's comments, David's hesitation, the subtle microaggressions buried in their words, lingered in the air. Emma touched his shoulder, bringing him back to the present. So, what's next? Marcus stared out the massive windows, the city stretching out below him like a sea of possibilities. He exhaled slowly, the weight of her questions settling over him. He had crossed one hurdle, but the journey was far from over. I don't know yet, he replied, his voice steady but thoughtful. But I'm going to find out. Marcus walked toward the elevator with a sense of purpose, still processing his conversation with Karen and David. As he approached the silver doors, he caught a glimpse of Patricia, a well-dressed woman in her late 50s, already waiting. She was known in the building as someone influential among the residents, a bit too involved in the affairs of others, Marcus thought, but always under the guise of being polite. When Patricia noticed Marcus approaching, her smile faltered ever so slightly. She pressed the elevator button again, though it was already lit. Marcus sighed inwardly, bracing himself for whatever conversation lay ahead. They hadn't exchanged more than pleasantries in the past, but every interaction had been marked with an air of superiority from Patricia. The elevator dinged, and the doors slid open. They stepped in together, with Patricia keeping just a little more space between them than necessary. She pressed the button for her floor, but didn't ask which floor Marcus needed. He leaned forward and pressed the button for the penthouse himself. As the doors closed, the silence stretched out, uncomfortable and heavy. Patricia finally spoke, her tone light but not entirely warm. So, Marcus, she said, drawing out his name in that way that always felt patronizing, I've been hearing some interesting news. You're moving into the penthouse, I take it? Marcus nodded, keeping his expression neutral. That's right. I'm really excited about it. Patricia mused, her lips curving into a tight smile. That's quite the accomplishment. Not many people manage to rise to such heights. The words hung in the air between them, and Marcus could feel the subtle barb buried in the compliment. It wasn't just about the penthouse. It was about him. She wasn't questioning the purchase. She was questioning his place in this world, in this building, in this community. And she wasn't hiding it very well. Marcus's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to smile. I've worked hard to get here, he replied evenly. It's been a long journey, but I'm proud of what I've achieved. Patricia's eyes flickered with something, surprise perhaps, or a brief moment of acknowledgement, but it passed quickly. She nodded, her hands tightening around the handle of her purse. I'm sure it has been, she said, her voice slightly clipped. But I have to say, it's different seeing someone like you in a place like this. Marcus raised an eyebrow, his patience wearing thin. Different? Patricia glanced at him, her smile returning, but it didn't reach her eyes. You know what I mean. We don't often see people from your background achieving something like this. It's inspiring, really. Marcus's heart rate picked up, the familiar heat rising in his chest. There it was. People from your background. The same coded language that had followed him his whole life. He could feel his frustration building, but he kept his face composed. This wasn't new, but it was always exhausting. Background? Marcus repeated, tilting his head slightly. I'm not sure I follow. Patricia chuckled, though there was no humor in it. Oh, don't be modest. I'm sure you've had to work extra hard to get where you are. It must be challenging, being the only one in a space like this. Marcus stared at her for a moment, searching for the right words. Every fiber of his being wanted to push back, to call her out on the condescension dripping from her words. But he knew how this game was played. He had played it his entire life. If he showed too much frustration, he'd be seen as angry. If he stayed quiet, he'd be seen as complacent. He chose his words carefully. It's always a challenge when people underestimate you, he said finally. But that just makes the victory even sweeter. Patricia blinked, her lips parting slightly as if she hadn't expected that response. She recovered quickly, though, offering another tight smile. Well, I suppose that's one way to look at it. Still, I imagine it must be different for you, adjusting to a place like this. Marcus clenched his fists at his sides, keeping his gaze steady. I don't see it as an adjustment. I've earned my place here, just like everyone else. There was a flicker of discomfort in Patricia's eyes, and she looked away, her smile fading slightly. Of course, she murmured. I didn't mean to imply otherwise. But she had implied it, and they both knew it. The silence that followed was heavy, each passing second dragging out the tension between them. Marcus could feel the weight of her unspoken judgments pressing down on him, the quiet assumptions she made about him and his place in this world. The elevator doors opened, and Patricia stepped out, turning back to offer one last parting comment. Well, I do hope you find your place here, Marcus. It's always interesting to see how things play out. Marcus nodded, his expression unreadable. I'm sure it will be, he said quietly. As the doors slid shut, Marcus let out a slow breath, his heart still racing. He had dealt with people like Patricia his entire life, people who masked their prejudice with polite smiles and carefully chosen words. People who saw him as an outsider, no matter how much he achieved or how hard he worked. He leaned back against the elevator wall, his mind replaying the conversation. He had kept his composure, but the frustration still simmered beneath the surface. It was moments like these that reminded him how far he still had to go. No matter how successful he became, no matter how much he achieved, there would always be people who saw him as different. The elevator dinged again, and the doors opened to reveal Emma standing there, her eyes lighting up when she saw Marcus. She stepped inside, immediately sensing the tension in his posture. Hey, she said softly, stepping closer to him. You okay? Marcus forced a smile, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. Yeah, just had an interesting conversation with Patricia. Emma frowned, her eyes narrowing. Let me guess, more of the same? Marcus nodded, leaning his head back against the wall. Yeah, the usual. Subtle jabs, veiled comments about my background. Emma sighed, crossing her arms. I swear, I don't know how you keep your cool with people like her. I'd lose it. Marcus chuckled, though there was little humor in it. I've had a lot of practice. Emma shook her head, her expression softening. You shouldn't have to deal with this, Marcus. You've earned your place here. You shouldn't have to prove yourself to anyone. I know, Marcus said quietly. But it's not that simple. People like Patricia, they're always going to see me as an outsider, no matter what I do. Emma touched his arm gently, her gaze steady. Then stop trying to fit in. You've done enough. It's time for people like her to adjust to you, not the other way around. Marcus looked at her, the weight of her words sinking in. Emma had always been the one person who saw him for who he was, without judgment or expectation. And maybe she was right. Maybe it was time to stop playing by their rules. I'll think about it, he said, his voice soft but resolute. The day of the open house arrived, and Marcus was up early, pacing the expansive penthouse with a mix of excitement and anxiety. His grand vision for the event was clear, to show the residents of Radiant Towers that he was not just an outsider, but a valuable addition to their community. Yet, as he glanced around at the sleek furniture and carefully curated art, a nagging doubt crept in. Would the residents embrace this change or reject it? The event was scheduled to start in the late afternoon, but Marcus decided to be ready well before. He wanted everything to be perfect, from the lighting to the ambient music. Emma had offered to help, but she had been held up with other commitments. It was up to Marcus to ensure everything was in place. As guests began to trickle in, Marcus tried to gauge their reactions. The early arrivals were a mixed group. Some appeared genuinely interested, while others were clearly skeptical. Patricia Whitmore was among the first to arrive, her presence as commanding as ever. Marcus greeted her with a warm smile, determined not to let her cool demeanor affect his own. "Welcome, Miss Whitmore," Marcus said, extending his hand. "I hope you find the event enjoyable." Patricia took his hand with a firm grip, her eyes scanning the room with a critical gaze. "Thank you, Mr. Johnson. It's quite the setup. I must say, I didn't expect this level of personal touch." Marcus noted the subtle critique in her tone, but chose to remain gracious. "I'm glad you could make it. Feel free to explore and let me know if you have any questions." As Patricia wandered off, Marcus noticed a few other residents making their way through the penthouse. Conversations were polite but distant. The sense of hesitation was palpable, and Marcus couldn't help but feel a twinge of frustration. He had hoped for a warmer reception. Around an hour into the event, the atmosphere began to shift. A few more residents arrived, and the initial coolness seemed to thaw slightly. Marcus was engaged in conversation with a young couple who seemed genuinely interested in his vision for the building when he noticed Patricia approaching him again. This time, her expression was less guarded. "Mr. Johnson," Patricia began, her tone more neutral. "I must admit, the longer I stay here, the more I understand what you're trying to achieve. It's certainly different from what we're used to." Marcus seized the opportunity. "I appreciate that, Ms. Whitmore. Change can be challenging, but it's often necessary for growth. I hope this event gives you a better sense of what I'm trying to accomplish here." Patricia nodded, though her demeanor remained reserved. "I suppose. It's not what I expected, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing." Marcus smiled, sensing a small victory. "I'm glad to hear that. It's important to me that this building evolves in a way that benefits everyone." As the evening wore on, the mood at the open house continued to improve. Some of the earlier guests had started mingling more freely, and a few even approached Marcus with genuine questions about his plans for Radiant Towers. Patricia, while still cautious, seemed to be engaging more with other residents, a sign that the initial resistance was softening. By the time the event was winding down, Marcus felt a cautious optimism. The open house had not been an overwhelming success, but it had made a significant impact. The initial cold reception had given way to a more open, if still tentative, acceptance. Patricia's attitude had shifted slightly, and that alone was a small victory in itself. As the last guests departed, Marcus took a moment to reflect on the evening. Emma arrived just as the final guests were leaving, her face lighting up with a supportive smile. "How did it go?" she asked, her voice filled with genuine interest. "Better than I expected," Marcus replied, feeling a mix of relief and satisfaction. "There were some cold receptions at first, but I think things are starting to shift. Patricia even seemed to soften a bit by the end." Emma raised an eyebrow, impressed. "That's great to hear. It sounds like you're making progress." Marcus nodded, looking around the now empty penthouse. "Yeah, it's a start. I know there's a long way to go, but I'm feeling more optimistic." Emma placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You've done a fantastic job tonight. It's not easy to change people's minds, but you're definitely on the right path." As they began to clean up, Marcus felt a renewed sense of determination. The open house had been a step in the right direction, and despite the challenges, he was more committed than ever to making Radiant Towers a place where everyone could feel welcome. The road ahead might be difficult, but with Emma's support and his own resolve, Marcus was ready to face whatever came next. The city lights of Radiant Towers shimmered like a constellation against the dark sky. From his penthouse, Marcus surveyed the urban landscape, a mixture of pride and weariness etched across his face. The journey had been arduous, fraught with obstacles and subtle resistance. The open house had been a milestone, but Marcus knew that real transformation required persistent effort and resilience. Months had passed since that pivotal event, and while the community had begun to show signs of change, Marcus felt that his work was far from complete. The opulence of his surroundings no longer seemed as dazzling as it once did. the challenges and subtle prejudices had left their mark. The initial resistance had softened somewhat, but the deep-rooted attitudes of some residents still lingered. Marcus was in his study, surrounded by documents and reports detailing the outcomes of recent community events and feedback from residents. The room was a sanctuary of sorts, with its sleek furnishings and expansive windows providing a view of the city's glowing lights. Yet, despite the tranquil setting, Marcus felt an undercurrent of frustration. He had faced and overcome many challenges in his life, but this one felt different, more personal, more ingrained. Emma entered the room, carrying a stack of papers and a warm smile that was a stark contrast to Marcus's contemplative mood. "Hey, Marcus," she said, setting the papers down on his desk. "I thought you might want to go over the latest reports and community feedback." Marcus looked up from the pile of documents, his face showing a mix of fatigue and determination. "Thanks, Emma. I've been reviewing the progress, but it feels like we're just scratching the surface. I keep thinking about the hurdles we still need to overcome." Emma took a seat across from him, her demeanor supportive and understanding. "It's natural to feel that way. Change is a slow process, especially when it involves deep-seated attitudes and long-standing traditions. But you've already made a significant impact." Marcus glanced at the feedback reports, which contained both praise and criticism. "I suppose there have been some positive developments. The community events have seen better turnouts, and more people are starting to participate in the new initiatives. But it still feels like there's so much more to do." Emma nodded, her eyes reflecting empathy. "Look at this comment," she said, pointing to a particular piece of feedback. One resident mentioned that they were initially skeptical, but are now starting to appreciate the diversity and energy you're bringing to the building. It's a small victory, but it's indicative of a shift in perspective. Marcus smiled faintly, feeling a small glimmer of hope. It's good to hear that some people are starting to see the value in what we're trying to achieve, but it's hard not to be disheartened by the continued resistance. Emma stood up, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "It's okay to feel disheartened. You're challenging the status quo, and that's never easy. But remember, every small change is a step toward a larger goal. The resistance you're facing is a sign that your presence is making a difference." Marcus nodded, his resolve strengthening. "I need to focus on the long-term impact and not let the setbacks overshadow the progress we've made. I can't let the resistance deter me." Emma smiled, her confidence in Marcus evident. "Exactly. And remember, you're not alone in this. We're all working toward the same goal, and together, we can continue to make progress." As Emma left the room, Marcus returned his gaze to the cityscape. The challenges ahead seemed daunting, but he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The journey to transform Radiant Towers was ongoing, and while it had been a struggle, the progress made so far was a testament to his efforts. In the weeks that followed, Marcus, with Emma's support, initiated new programs aimed at fostering greater community engagement and inclusivity. He organized workshops and discussions that addressed the issues of diversity and acceptance head-on. These events were designed to encourage open dialogue and understanding among the residents. The changes were gradual, but Marcus noticed subtle shifts in the community's atmosphere. Conversations became warmer, and there was a growing sense of camaraderie. Residents who had once been skeptical began to participate more actively in community events, and even Patricia, who had been a vocal critic, showed signs of warming up. Her interactions with Marcus became less confrontational, and she started to engage more positively with the initiatives he was leading. One evening, as Marcus walked through the lobby, he overheard a conversation between two residents. They were discussing the recent community event, praising the diverse range of perspectives and ideas that had been shared. It was a small but significant indication that the community was beginning to embrace the changes Marcus had worked so hard to implement. As he stood in the lobby, Marcus took a moment to reflect on the journey. The road ahead was still uncertain, and there were likely to be more challenges. But the progress made so far, coupled with the growing acceptance and understanding among the residents, gave him hope for the future. With Emma by his side and a community that was gradually opening up, Marcus felt more confident than ever in his mission. He knew that the work of transforming Radiant Towers was far from over, but he was ready to face whatever came his way. The journey had been difficult, but it had also been deeply rewarding. The seeds of change had been planted, and Marcus was determined to nurture them until they blossomed into a thriving, inclusive community. As he looked out over the city, Marcus felt a renewed sense of determination. The road ahead would be challenging, but with persistence and support, he was confident that Radiant Towers could become a place where diversity and acceptance were not just goals, but realities. The journey was far from complete, but Marcus was ready to continue the work step by step toward a brighter future. Thank you for joining us on this journey of transformation and hope. If this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to our channel and hitting the notification bell to stay updated on all our latest content. Share this video with friends and family to spread the message of unity and inclusivity. Together, we can make a difference.